Hamburg, May 1945. The city didn't live, it moaned. Stone husks of houses turned to dust, and charred beams jutted out like bones in the ground. The air smelled of smoke, dampness, and human despair. In the squares where flowers and coffee were once sold, now lay shards of glass, old boots, and someone's letters blackened by smoke. Lotta walked through the silence, clutching a bucket to her chest. She was 23, but in a mirror, if it had survived, she would have seen a woman of about 40. Shadows under her eyes, cracked lips, hair tangled and cut where lice had been. On her arm, an old bandage soaked with blood and pus. She walked barefoot. Her shoes had been stolen 3 days ago by boys who now call themselves hunters. In the distance, voices could be heard. Not German. Rough, throaty with a foreign rhythm. English. Americans. Lotta stopped, held her breath, and pressed against the wall of a half-destroyed house. From around the corner, she saw 3 soldiers in dirty uniforms. One sat on a crate, eating something from a can. Another threw pieces of chocolate to children crowding around. The third stood with his back turned, looking at the ruins silent. Terror gripped her. She had heard so many stories about Americans breaking into houses, taking revenge on women for everything Germany had done. She knew if they noticed her, it was over. But the one standing with his back suddenly turned, and looked straight at her. His eyes were different. Not cold, not angry, rather tired. He said something, quietly, incomprehensibly, but gestured, "Wait!" Lotta bolted to the side. The bucket clanged against the ground. The metallic sound shattered the silence. She ran, leaping over bricks, until she felt someone following. "Wait!" A shout, not threatening, just human. She tripped, fell, scraped her knees, and suddenly saw boots in front of her. American boots. The soldier slowly crouched, took off his helmet. A young face, dusted with a bit of blood on the cheek. He held a canteen. "You're hurt." Lotta didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. No threat. He extended the canteen closer. She stared at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether she could even breathe near this person. Then she took a sip. The cold water burned her throat. But in that instant, she felt alive for the first time in months. The soldier nodded. "James." He tapped his chest. "James Miller." Lotta just nodded, still trembling. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel fear, only confusion and a strange calm. The next day, Lotta saw him again. She was standing by the charred wall of a former bakery, hoping to find something edible. The air smelled of mold, wet wood, and dead flour. Once, this smell meant bread and comfort. Now only decay. Footsteps were heard outside. Soldiers. Americans again. Lotta pressed against the wall, froze, ready to disappear. But suddenly, the same voice. "Miss, you okay?" She slowly peeked out. It was him, James. No weapon in hand, just a piece of bread and a tin of canned food. He stepped toward her, then another step, cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal. "Here, eat." He placed the bread on a crate and stepped back. Lotta didn't move. Her gaze darted between him and the bread. "Eat," he repeated, pointing to food. She didn't understand all the words, but the meaning was clear. Slowly, she approached, grabbed the bread, and started eating hungrily, teeth clenched. Crumbs fell to the floor. Her fingers shook. James just stood, watching. On his face, not pity, not a victorious look. Rather quiet understanding. "What's your name?" he asked. Lotta froze, bread in hand. "Name," he repeated, tapping his chest. "James." Then he pointed to her. "You." She hesitated, then said, "Latte." It took him a few seconds to repeat correctly. "Lotta." She nodded. They were silent. Outside, distant shouts, barking dogs, rare gunshots. The city lived in agony. James pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and offered the second one to her. She hesitated, then took it, awkwardly bringing it to her lips. The smoke burned her throat, but her chest felt warmer. He smiled. "Good," he said quietly, as if whispering something personal. At that moment, Lotta first noticed his hands, calloused, scratched. On his wrist, a worn bracelet engraved with initials EM. Your wife. She asked softly with an accent. James looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to speak at all. Sister, he answered after a short pause. She died in London. Bomb. She lowered her gaze. I'm sorry. Me too, he said. War makes ghosts from everyone. Lotta suddenly felt something inside her break. Not fear, not grief, something deeper. The realization that this person, an enemy, had also lost someone he loved. For the first time since the war began, she truly felt ashamed, not for her nation, but for believing that suffering belonged only to them, the Germans. James stood, adjusted his belt, looked at her one last time, and quietly said, Be careful. Bad men out there. Not all like me. She watched him go until his figure disappeared into the smoke. And in the silence, among the rubble and ashes, Lotta whispered to herself in English for the first time. Thank you. 3 days passed. Lotta didn't know why she still remembered that American. The war had taught her not to remember. Everything you love dies if you hold on to it. Yet James' face kept appearing in her mind. His voice, his calmness, even the smell of cigarette smoke. Now it seemed warm, not threatening. She lived in the ruins of an old house. Once it had been a library. Books, stuck together by moisture and soot, lay everywhere like dead birds. Sometimes she lit a candle and read the charred pages, not for meaning, but just to hear human words, not screams and commands. That evening, she heard footsteps again. Slow, heavy, confident. She froze, grabbed a rusty knife, the only thing left from the kitchen. The steps stopped right at the entrance. Then a knock, 3 times. Quiet. Lotta? A familiar voice. She exhaled, opened the door. James stood there, in uniform, but without a weapon, a backpack on his shoulder. You're still here, he said. She didn't know what to answer, just nodded. He came in, looked around the room. You live here? He asked, looking at the ruins. Yes, my home before. He nodded, said nothing. Then he pulled out from his backpack a can of stew, a canteen, and something wrapped in newspaper. She opened it. Inside was a photograph. A little girl with braids and a wide smile. Emma, he said. My sister. Lotta stared at the photo for a long time, as if it was a piece of a world she hadn't seen since childhood. She is beautiful. Was, he corrected softly. She was. They sat side by side, eating in silence. Only the occasional sound of dripping water and the creak of the wind filled the pauses. Why you help me? Lotta suddenly asked. James shrugged. Because someone helped my family once. A German doctor, back in England, 1940. He could have run, but he didn't. He looked at her directly, without pity. War doesn't make everyone evil. Some just survive. These words stuck in her like a bullet. She remembered how a neighbor denounced people for a piece of bread. How men who swore loyalty to the Führer beat women for crying. She whispered, survive, tasting the word. When he left, she sat by the wall for a long time, clutching Emma's photograph, and realized this American was not just a stranger. He was a living reminder that humanity still existed. That night, Lotta slept without nightmares for the first time. She woke to a knock. Outside, the dawn was gray, the sky low, pressing down on the earth. Water dripped through a hole in the ceiling, like a metronome, marking the end of the old world. She opened the door, and there he was again, James. That day he looked tired, pale with red eyes. His uniform was stained with dirt and soot. You okay? She asked, but he didn't answer right away. He just looked past her at the ground. In his hands, he held an envelope, worn with English writing. Got a letter today. From home, he said, as if through force. She saw. He was afraid to open it. Bad news? She asked softly. He nodded. Maybe. My mother's sick. They don't say much. He sat directly on the floor, resting his head on his hands. It was strange to see a soldier, a man with a rifle and a medal, so lost. Lotta moved closer, sat beside him, just stayed silent. Then she gently touched his hand. He didn't pull away. In Germany, no letters. Only orders, she said quietly. We wrote, but nobody read. He looked at her, as if realizing for the first time how different their paths were, and how similarly they had been broken. She took the envelope, traced its edge with her finger, then returned it. You should read. I can't, he replied. Not now. If it's bad, I'll lose myself. She nodded. Then later, when you're ready. He looked at her, and in that moment, everything between them, fear, language, war, seemed to vanish. Only two people remained, who simply didn't want to be alone. He suddenly asked, Do you still hate us? Lotta stayed silent for a long time. I hated everyone, she finally said. Even myself. Silence. Only the sound of dripping water and breathing. James stood, walked to the door. Before leaving, he said, Tomorrow we move south. Maybe last time I see you. Her heart tightened. She didn't know what to say, only whispered, Then come tonight. He turned, surprised, and said nothing, but in his gaze appeared something she hadn't seen since 1939. Hope. That evening, Lotta sat by a candle, fingers tracing the charred pages of a book. The words blurred. Her eyes could no longer see letters, only flashes from the past. Her mother at the train station, her brother gone to the front, and SS officers shouting when there was no bread. She heard soldiers laughing somewhere in the distance, Americans drunk, happy, as if everything was over. But for her, the war hadn't ended. She had just changed the flag. When the door creaked softly, she didn't flinch. She knew who it was. James. Without a weapon, without uniform. Just a canteen and a look in his eyes that carried something dangerous. Not anger, but a feeling he probably tried to kill inside himself. He sat opposite her, placing the canteen between them. You said come tonight, he said. Yes. For a while, they simply sat in silence. The candle hissed, wax dripped. Outside, rain fell, and the sound softened, as if the world was trying to muffle everything happening inside. Lotta asked, You leave tomorrow? Yes. Early morning. They say new orders. You come back? He shrugged. Don't know. Maybe not. She moved closer, looked straight into his eyes. There was no certainty, no heroism, only fatigue. The kind that lives inside those who've seen too much death. Why you look at me like that? She asked. He smirked. Because I forgot what peace looks like. These words struck harder than any touch. She quietly said, There is no peace, only silence. Then I'll take silence. She realized they were not looking for love. They were seeking a pause. The world had fallen, but somewhere among the ashes, they found a moment to simply be alive. James extended his hand, and she let him take it, without fear, without thinking about who was enemy, who was victor, just human to human. That night had no shape, no color. It was a warm spot in endless winter. In the morning, he left, without words, without goodbye. He only left his dog tag and a letter, still unopened. Lotta stared at it for a long time, and finally cried for the first time since the war. Quietly, silently, as if ashamed that she still had the ability to feel. 2 weeks passed since James had left. 2 weeks filled with the sounds of footsteps that were no longer there, and a voice that now existed only in her head. Hamburg was gradually coming back to life, but this living city felt like a zombie. The Americans set up kitchens, distributed rations, posted notices. Children ran barefoot, playing war among the ruins. Women carried infants in their arms, conceived not by their husbands. Some cried from hunger, some from guilt, and some stayed silent because words no longer meant anything. Lotta still lived in the same house, without a roof. Now it smelled of coal, smoke, and candle wax. Sometimes she felt as if the walls still remembered his breath. Every corner, every dusty crack whispered, he was here. Sometimes at night, she dreamed he returned. Opened the door, placed a canteen on the table, and said in his calm, slightly tired voice, "You survived." But then she woke up, and the only sound in the house was water dripping from a beam into a bucket. On the third Monday after his departure, she finally decided to open the envelope. Her fingers trembled as if touching gunpowder. The letter smelled of dust and tobacco, his scent. She studied the English letters, uneven with tiny stains. The words were heavy to read, but the meaning struck her heart. "Lotta, if I don't come back, remember you are not the enemy. You have the right to start again, even if the world tells you you don't." She read it 3 times. Then she placed the letter on her chest and closed her eyes. The world around seemed to stop. No footsteps, no wind, not even drops. Only her breathing, steady and heavy, like the breath of a person who suddenly remembered they were alive. She clutched James' dog tag, the one he had left on the table, and squeezed it until her hand ached. The cold metal pressed into her skin, and there was something comforting in it, as if a piece of him remained inside her. In the evening, snow began to fall. The first flakes landed softly, as if afraid to touch the ashes. Lotta went outside, barefoot, without a coat, without fear. The air was icy, but clean for the first time in years. She raised her hand, and a single snowflake melted on her skin. The snow settled over the ruins gently, like a blanket, covering the traces of war, hiding everything that should be forgotten. The wind calmed, and a rare silence hung over the city, not dead, but peaceful. Lotta stood and thought, maybe God has returned, just in the form of snow. Spring 1946. Almost a year after the surrender, Hamburg began to resemble a city, not a cemetery. On the ruins, rebuilding had started again, brick by brick, life by life. American posters now hung everywhere. Rebuild, work, hope. But to Lotta, all these words sounded like mockery. She now worked in the kitchen at a displaced persons camp, washing pots, peeling potatoes, and every day watching the faces of soldiers, new, strange, indifferent. Every time she saw a uniform, her heart skipped. What if it was him? But every time, no, not that voice, not that look. At night, she returned to her house without a roof. James' letter lay on the windowsill, already faded by the sun. The dog tag, always with her, around her neck, under her clothes. She didn't remove it, not even in her sleep. Sometimes she dreamed she was walking along the Elbe, and an American column approached. And somewhere in the middle, among hundreds of identical faces, he turned, said, "I told you, Lotta, I'd come back." And she woke up, face wet with tears, and a throat that held a scream, but it did not come out. In spring, the camp began to close. The Americans were going home, to Ohio, Kansas, Texas. Every day at the station, crowds. Women crying by the trains. Some were former German wives of American soldiers. War brides, as they were called. They were allowed to go to the States if they had a husband confirmed by the Union. Lotta watched them, beautiful, powdered, with suitcases, rings on their fingers, and thought, why not me? Although she knew the answer, because he was gone, and the missing are not officially waited for, only by the heart. One day she walked through the market and saw someone had hung a photograph on the wall, a group of American soldiers in Bremen. Among them, a man with a face resembling James. A shadow, a smile, a gaze to the side. She stood before the photo for a long time, until the seller said, "This is from last spring. They're not here anymore." But Lotta already knew what she would do. She would find him, not for love, for purpose. That evening, she gathered everything she had, the letter, the dog tag, a piece of bread, and an old map. She wrote on the wall with charcoal, "If I don't come back, I tried." And she set out south, to where he had been last seen. The snow had melted. The earth was breathing again, wet and soft under her bare feet. Puddles reflected the gray sky and broken rooftops. Ahead, along sunlit roads, stretched a new war. A war not for survival, but for hope itself. Lotta walked south. The roads were broken, bridges destroyed, and fields flooded from melting snow. Every step echoed in her bones, Every glance searched for a sign. Anything, even a shadow, a footprint, a faint smell, that would tell her, he is here. The air was cold but carried the faint smell of thawing earth and the distant sea. Birds cautiously began to return, chirping softly over the ruins. Each sound was a reminder that life persisted, even if fragile. Almost 2 months passed. She reached a small town on the border with Denmark. The town was half ruined, half living, like a ghost slowly waking. Old brick houses stood with shattered windows, peeling plaster, and doors barely hanging on their hinges. But there was movement, too. Children played with scraps of wood, women carrying water, men repairing roofs with whatever materials they could find. And the smell of the sea, salty, crisp, and alive, mixed with smoke and rotting wood. It felt both foreign and somehow familiar to her, like a memory she couldn't place. In one of the narrow alleys, she noticed a soldier's truck. Its paint was chipped, the engine cold, and on the roof, an old American uniform draped carelessly. Her heart froze. She stopped, listening to the wind, to the distant waves, to the creaking of old doors. And then she heard a familiar voice, quiet, tired, but unmistakably alive. "Lotta?" She froze, breath caught in her throat. "James," she whispered, unable to believe her lips could form the word. He stood among the mud, debris, and fragments of a war-torn town, hands in his pockets, trying to appear indifferent. But his eyes, those eyes she had imagined countless nights, found her immediately. They were tired, dusty, and alive. No mask, no role, only him. At first, there were no words, only breath, the distant hum of the town, and the cold wind pressing against him. "I thought maybe," he began, but his voice faltered, lost in the tension of disbelief. "I looked for you," she replied, her voice breaking, herself not believing she had the courage to say it. He stepped closer. "You came all this way?" he said softly, almost in a whisper, as if afraid to break the fragile world they had found themselves in. "I had to," she answered, clutching the dog tag against her chest. "I could not know." They stood on the dusty road, among the ruins of a foreign country. Broken tiles crunched underfoot. The wind tugged at her hair. The smell of damp earth and sea filled their noses. And for the first time since the war began, it was quiet. Not the silence of death, not the tense, gunshot-laden stillness, but the silence of a meeting so profound words could not describe it. He reached out his hand, and she took it, without fear, without doubt, only relief that someone she had waited for, feared lost, had survived. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, smiling for the first time in months. His smile was fragile, uncertain, but real. "I didn't think I could," she replied, tears welling up, catching the sunlight in her eyelashes. At that moment, Lotta realized it all. The ruined houses, the lost years, the fear, the nights of hunger and cold, all of it had led to this. This meeting, this quiet miracle, was the reason she had survived. They stood for a long time, just stood, holding hands, feeling warmth transfer through cold fingers. The world around them, destroyed, scarred, silent, suddenly seemed safe. Even the wind seemed to pause. The sea held its breath. And for a fleeting instant, two people who had endured the worst of humanity's cruelty could finally just be alive together. But beyond the horizon, a new day was rising, and with it, new trials, because the war in their hearts hadn't ended. And to live forward, they would have to walk through pain, doubt, and fear again. After the meeting, Lotta and James stopped in a small village near the border. The night was warm, quiet. The earth smelled of freshly sprouted grass, rain, and the salt of the sea. They sat side by side, shoulder to shoulder, silent, listening to hum of the city sleeping below. But the past did not let go. Lotta woke from a nightmare. She saw fires, screams, people she could not save. And nearby, she heard a foreign voice, sharp, threatening, German again, orders she no longer understood. James noticed her waking. "Nightmare?" he asked softly. She nodded, unable to speak. He took her hand, and in that simple gesture, there was all the warmth a human could hold after surviving a war. "You're not alone," he said. "I never was." She whispered, and for the first time in years, the words sounded alive, not cold. The next day, they received news of their families. James learned part of his family had died. Some survived. Lotta found out one uncle had miraculously survived the bombing, and now her family, at least partially, existed again. They sat by the riverbank. She watched the water flow calmly and thought how the war had taken almost everything, but left the chance to live. What now? She asked. Now, he smiled, holding her hands. We build something. Anything. Together. For the first time, Lotta allowed herself to smile without fear, guilt, or doubt. Her heart no longer tightened at every sound, every glance. She realized the past would always knock at the door, but she could choose whether to let it in. The sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky orange. The city, once ash-gray, now glowed with soft light. And among the ruins, Lotta finally felt that life was not war, not survival. It was a chance. Spring 1946 gradually turned into summer. Lotta and James walked along the road, leading to a small port on the border. Hamburg remained behind. Ruins, smoke, fear, all now part of memory, not life. She held a letter James had written her on his last day before departure. Lotta, if you are reading this, it means I returned. Life isn't over. Anything is still possible. Even among the ruins, you can build a home. James smiled. Ready? He asked. Always, she replied. They approached a small ship that would take them to a new place, a new life. The wind blew Lotta's hair. The sun set behind the horizon, painting the sky gold and pink. At that moment, they were no longer German or American, not victims of war, not a soldier and a girl with a charred past. Just people who had survived. Lotta looked at James, eyes tired but alive, full of what had almost disappeared before. Hope. Do you think we can really start over? She asked. We don't have a choice, he said, taking her hand. But I think we can. As the ship pulled away, Lotta looked back at the shore. Ruined houses, empty streets, snow that once covered the ashes. All of it now belonged to the past. But ahead lay a road, not painted with fear, but glowing with warmth. And in this new beginning, among the smell of salt, chimney smoke, and morning wind, they understood the most important thing. Life goes on, even after war, even after fear, even after what seemed impossible. They walked side by side, step by step, and every step was a promise that humanity and hope still live, among the ruins and among people who once thought they had lost everything. And so, beneath a horizon shining with new colors, Lotta and James began their new life. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to the channel, give a like, and hit the bell to never miss a new video. Leave a comment telling us which story you'd like to see next.